It seems like all hell's breaking loose in Portland and Chicago, and that is very likely what Trump wants. Because even as both cities are fighting his efforts to send in the military, federal agents already in them, they've been accused of escalating the situation. They're seemingly trying to make them resemble the crime-ridden, war-ravaged wastelands that he's made them out to be. So in Portland, for example, what we've seen has been a few months of pretty small protest based around a building used by ICE in the southwest part of the city. But instead, you've got Trump claiming that what's been taking place is the destruction of the city. And with that, he's vowed to deploy troops to protect what he's called war-ravaged Portland, as well as ICE facilities under attack by, quote, Antifa and other domestic terrorists. And all this attention, it's reportedly spurred people from outside the city to come there, including right-wing counter-demonstrators. And in fact, this weekend, you had what appear to be right-wing activists and influencers waving banners and cheering when federal agents shot tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper balls toward a crowd of more than 100 protesters gathered outside of the ICE building. All of which appear to be a significant escalation by ICE on the demonstrators without really anything spurring that on. With reports showing that agents had previously kept their crowd dispersal efforts to the driveway and the street immediately outside of the building, but this time they extended their efforts by several blocks. Right, and as that was happening in one small corner of the city, you also had a legal battle playing out. And with that, on Saturday, you had a Trump-appointed judge issuing a temporary restraining order blocking the administration from sending in Oregon's National Guard, or with the judge pointing to what she called substantial evidence that the protests at the Portland ICE facility were not significantly violent or disruptive in the days or even weeks leading up to the president's directive. And with that, saying that she expected a trial court to agree with the state that the president had exceeded his constitutional authority. And while the administration, they quickly appealed, you also had Trump trying to get around her order by trying to send in 200 members of the California National Guard, who notably, one, had already been sent to Los Angeles, and two, a different federal judge already ruled last month that the troops sent to the LA area had been used illegally as a national police force. And actually, in response to Trump's effort to turn them on another state, you had California saying that it would be joining Oregon and suing Trump. But then also, you had the judge in the Portland case quickly calling an emergency hearing. And there, she revised her restraining order to cover the, quote, relocation, federalization, or deployment of members of the National Guard of any state or the District of Columbia in the state of Oregon. But they're also telling lawyers from the Justice Department that the president was in direct contravention of her order. But then despite all that, you also had Trump on Saturday ordering the activation of 300 National Guard troops to Chicago against the wishes of Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. But then Pritzker last night claiming that the Guard in his state had been informed that Trump had ordered 400 members of the Texas National Guard to be in his state, as well as others, including Oregon, although that was before the judge's revised order. But in any case, the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago are now suing the Trump administration as well. And so while we wait to see if they also get the National Guard deployment blocked, we've also seen outlets reporting that federal agents in Chicago have become increasingly aggressive. Right? And with that, you've got videos of agents deploying tear gas, pepper balls, and roughly throwing protesters to the ground going viral. And so on Friday, for example, you had federal agents reportedly throwing a tear gas canister at people on a busy street and then leaving the scene, with that also happening right in front of an elementary school. Also on Saturday, there was this highly contested thing that happened, where you had an agent shooting and injuring a driver who Trump officials claimed rammed her car into a federal law enforcement vehicle. But then DHS spokeswoman Tricia McLaughlin describing the shooting incident as a response to an ambush that was carried out by domestic terrorists who also threw gas, rocks, and bottles at law enforcement. Also, law enforcement alleged that the driver had been armed with a semi-automatic weapon, but charging documents didn't mention a weapon. And so with that, you had Pritzker saying he wanted more information and didn't really trust the official account.
It's really hard to know exactly what the facts are, and they won't let us access the facts. They are just putting out their propaganda, and then we've got to later determine what actually happened.
Right, and then with that, you also had Pritzker saying that he had directed state agencies to investigate a recent raid at an apartment building on Chicago's south side. And there, he was referring to reports that children had been zip-tied and held, and that elderly people had been thrown into a U-Haul for 3 hours. And Pritzker adding that he believed that some of the people detained were also U.S. citizens. And so, with all that, you had Pritzker making the argument that this chaos, it's what Trump wants.
They are the ones that are making it a war zone. They want mayhem on the ground. They want to create the war zone so that they can send in even more troops.
But ultimately, that's where we are with the situation right now. Obviously, we're gonna have to wait to see what happens, both legally and on the ground, especially because, in this part's my opinion, it does feel like Donald Trump is like trying to set up the chaos for something to happen really big so it could kind of justify him to do something even bigger, which also feels crazy to say at this point, because essentially it feels like Donald Trump is having Texas invade Illinois. But that said, that's the news, a little bit of my opinion. And of course, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, opinions, reactions, especially if you're in the states being affected right now.